The Bataan Death March was the forcible transfer from Sasha, PT, and Marvelous to Camp O'Donnell by the Imperial Japanese Army of 60,000 through 80,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war, which began on April 9, 1942. After the 3-month Battle of Bataan in the Philippines during World War II, about 2,500 through 10,000 Filipino and 100 through 650 American prisoners of war died before they could reach their destination. The reported death tolls vary, especially among Filipino POWs, because historians cannot determine how many prisoners blended in the civilian population and escaped.
Japanese butchery, disease, exposure to the blazing sun, lack of food, and lack of water took the lives of approximately 5,200 Americans along the way. Many prisoners were bayoneted, shot, beheaded, or just left to die on the side of the road. The ordeal lasted 5 days for some and up to 12 days for others. Although the Japanese were unprepared for the large number of prisoners in their care, their brutality lay in the Japanese attitude that a soldier should die before surrender. A warrior's surrender meant the forfeiture of all rights to treatment as a human being. Many of the prisoners were battle-worn and incapable of keeping up the grueling pace of the march, especially in the tropical heat with little water. Those who dropped from exhaustion or sickness, fell behind, broke ranks to fetch water, or tried to escape, were killed. Men who could not rise the next morning to continue were often buried alive or beaten to death with the shovels of the ditch diggers, other prisoners who were forced to carve out graves along the way. At the railhead at San Fernando, prisoners were jammed into small, pre-war boxcars, 100 men or more into convoys meant for 40. There was little air in the oven-like cars, and hundreds of men died standing up. Finally, after an additional march, the sick, starving, and brutalized captives were herded into prison camps, one for Filipino soldiers and another for Americans, across the road from each other at former Philippine Army training ground called Camp O'Donnell. Here, from April to October 1942, thousands of men died of sickness and starvation. During that time, the American prisoners were divided into forced labor gangs and trucked throughout the Philippines to build airfields and roads. The story of the Bataan Death March has come to dominate the role that the Philippines played in World War II. The Japanese military had forced marches in other places it had conquered, and it worked to death thousands of British, Dutch, and Australian prisoners of war. But those atrocities did not make headlines until later. Even the Bataan Death March was something of a secret for several years. At first, the American government, fearing that Japanese forces would retaliate against their captives, embargoed news and details of the march. Then, in January 1944, in part to launch a war bond drive, but also to reinflate the fighting spirit of a war-weary United States, the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt released details of the march that had been provided by a handful of captives who had escaped and made their way to Australia. It was in this manner that what quickly became known as the Bataan Death March became a legend of the evils of war. After the end of World War II, the Japanese commander of the invasion forces in the Philippines, Lieutenant General Hama Masaharu, was charged with responsibility for the march and widespread abuses at Camp O'Donnell. He was tried and convicted by a U.S. military commission in Manila in January 1946 and was executed by a firing squad on April 3rd. In the years that followed, the men who fought in the Philippines formed a veterans organization, the American Defenders of Bataan and Corridor, to press for reparations from Japan and better treatment by the American government of the veterans of these campaigns. In the 1980s, the U.S. officially recognized the suffering and sacrifice of these veterans, awarding them the Bronze Star and eventually classifying them as 100% disabled for government pensions.